problem started with a book. Actually, I suppose it started with a show, Dragons, a fantasy made real, that I watched enraptured late one school night. And you could say it made me a little obsessed, not just with dragons, but with the paradox right there in the show's title. If dragons aren't real, the show asked, how does seemingly every culture, no matter how far apart, have legends of the same creature? It's a question that kind of ruined my life.
Who are you?
I'm the toy dragon!
There's one obvious solution to the dragon paradox. 7-year-old me would have told you. Dragons are real animals. They can just, turn invisible or something, and that's why scientists haven't noticed. And to be fair to my younger self, the worldwide predominance of the dragon myth is genuinely remarkable. There is a fascinating anthropological mystery we need to unravel here. But young me wasn't here for that. I was going to prove that dragons existed as living, breathing creatures. So I went to a primary source. I had a few dragon books when I was younger, but really I had one dragon book. Dragonology is the text that truly began to slow cook my mind with dragon fever. These pages seem to contain answers for my every burning question. How dragons breathe fire, how they took flight, the consistency of their dung. And the whole thing was written from the perspective of a fake naturalist. It's really no wonder I treated it like an actual guidebook. It's really no wonder I became so obsessed. Yet there was a problem. None of my sources were lining up. Books and documentaries disagreed on whether dragons were friendly or aggressive, two-legged or four-legged, a few meters long or a few hundred. Looking directly at global myths and legends only frustrated me further. Everything seemed inconsistent, like these things were made up. But I wasn't ready to give in. Obviously, I reassured myself, there are multiple species of dragon, and different cultures have interacted with different ones. This taxonomy-based explanation for divergences in folklore was the loophole many of my favorite pieces of dragon media employed anyway. So I began to obsessively categorize the dragons of fiction and mythology, disqualifying interpretations that failed to meet my invented criteria for real dragons. If a dragon had hair, not a dragon. If it couldn't fly, not a dragon. If it sang about reading, actually those dragons got a pass. I thought the blue one was cool. Looking back, this full-blown fixation on classification is kind of funny, and kind of, I spent a lot of time wandering into imagined realms during this period, researching and looking for dragons, and though I remember being happy, I also remember feeling isolated, and just generally confused about why everyone seemed to interact with the world so differently than I did. And somehow, I thought the solution was to talk about dragons more. I felt that if I could explain the topic well enough, if I could disentangle the taxonomy and solve the paradox, I don't know. So it almost felt like fate when at the peak of my dragon-themed social idiosyncrasy, DreamWorks released the first How to Train Your Dragon film. A story about dragons, but also otherness, maturity, empathy, loneliness, and being an outsider because you like dragons too much. Yeah, it's no surprise this movie struck a chord with my young self. At its core, How to Train Your Dragon explores why a social outsider might sympathize with or even relate to the non-human or monstrous. At the start of the film, lead character Hiccup desires societal acceptance, which in his Viking culture requires physical strength and an unthinking readiness to commit violence against a demonized other, in this case dragons, two traits he distinctly lacks. When he finally gets the chance to kill a dragon and gain approval, his guilt prevents him from finishing the job.
I did this.
Instead, he nurses the creature back to health, and though Hiccup believes the reason he befriended the dragon instead of slaying it is because he's weak and an overthinker, it becomes clear the real reason is because he couldn't help but connect with the dragon's plight. He encountered a frightened, lonely, ostracized being and saw his own reflection. Now, I'm not going to act like young me was conscious of all these themes. I was mainly pulled in by the dragon's designs, the music, which is just what it actually sounds like to ride a dragon, I'm sure of it, and the fact the narrative pauses around the hour mark to show us a detailed classification system. Let's go! Though on some level I connected my experiences to that of the protagonists, I honestly wasn't self-aware enough to do so more than subconsciously. I remember thinking, wow, it sure would be tough to be an overly obsessive social castaway. Good thing everyone thinks I'm the coolest. It can be a challenging thing to reflect on your past self. I was cleaning out my childhood attic recently, and I found some old dragon drawings that brought back mixed memories. Recollections of sitting on my own, creating sketch after sketch. I recall how tightly I pressed the pencil, like I was trying to will dragons into existence through the sheer force of my tiny hand. In the book An Instinct for Dragons, anthropologist David E. Jones theorizes that creating art of draconic monsters is a deep-rooted human instinct, derived from an intrinsic fear of reptilian predators. Although most scholars disagree with Jones's findings, I certainly recall my art coming from someplace primal. The truth is, no single explanation for the cultural universality of dragons is entirely sufficient. Looking around the animal kingdom, there's all sorts of species that might have birthed scaly legends in the minds of ancient people. Hell, the very word dragon comes from the Latin draconis, a term synonymous with large snake. But not all cultures with dragon myths exist in proximity to formidable reptiles. Dinosaur fossils have a broader distribution, and one can certainly imagine how such remains might also conjure draconic images, but direct connections are difficult to prove definitively. The anthropological origins of dragons likely aren't a straight line. Fiction is simple. The truth is, well, it's messy. I think that's part of why child me held so tightly onto the idea that dragons were literal creatures. I wanted them to be direct, categorizable, something that I could understand and control. I could at least know my dragon facts. Perhaps it's only natural for those who struggle or have struggled with human interaction to seek knowledge of the monstrous. I've been rereading Ryoku Kuri's monster-centric manga Dungeon Meshi now that it's being adapted into an anime, and it's kind of wild how closely parts of it track with my personal experience. Well, in a way. What begins as a standard fantasy adventure narrative quickly goes off the rails, as the protagonist, Laios, an archetypal knight in shining armor, is revealed to be a monster fanatic determined to study and, cook every creature in the dungeon. It's like Lord of the Rings meets an episode of Chopped. It's so unapologetically bizarre. But Dungeon Meshi ultimately offers a surprisingly nuanced reflection on what it means to process the world differently. Through the series, we're shown Laios cannot pick up on social cues the same way as his peers, nor does he recognize that most people don't want to hear a never-ending barrage of monster facts. Though often framed through a comedic culinary lens, Laios' desire to comprehend the non-human ultimately stems from his difficulties connecting with the human. Perhaps Dungeon Meshi's greatest achievement is its ability to pull you into Laios' perspective. Like How to Train Your Dragon, the narrative is willing to slow down and linger on the granular details of its world, getting so specific with food preparation that if you had monster parts on hand, I think you could cook these meals. It's a story just as singularly obsessed with monster biology and their classifications as its protagonist, and teaches the viewer to think in the same terms. And even if you don't share the same particular enthusiasm, that desire to know a topic inside and out, to fully understand the rules of a subject is, at least for me, a relatable one. Though my obsessions aren't exactly the same, I've never wanted to eat dragons, I do know what an all-consuming interest feels like.